This is how I teach my beginning knitting class. And so welcome to any of you who are new or are looking to teach beginning knitting. This is my take on how I teach beginning knitting. I've been teaching beginner knitters for probably 15 or 20 years in some capacity. I teach in my home. I teach at the local library system. I have taught in the school systems. I have taught groups of friends. I teach independent one-on-one classes. So this is just going to be my take so that you might get some ideas from me on how I teach and what I teach and what might work for you. When I taught children how to knit, I taught them only the knit stitch, and we made little covers for tissue, packs of tissue. So we made a square of knitting about this big. We cast on a certain number of stitches depending on the weight of yarn we were using, and we knit all the rows. We got a garter stitch square. We folded it in and just seamed two little sides with the slit open down the middle so that they could give it to their moms or put it in their backpacks, and put a little piece, some tissues in there. Those tissue packs that you keep in your purse or in your backpack get all mangled up, and so it was just a really easy way to teach the knitting technique in a class or two. I don't do a lot of kids teaching anymore. Mostly I'm doing it adults at my local library system where they have a legacy fund and the classes are free. They're not allowed to charge anyone for the classes, and they also give the yarn and the needles. So you can't get it any cheaper than that. So my classes are always full and there's always a waiting list because of this great program that the library offers. Now, I don't teach really through my LYS in that capacity because this is local to me and the LYS can't offer it for free, but I do tend to send all my knitters there to buy their next set of supplies, and then my local yarn store would offer kind of the next level of knitting. At the library I also do Beyond Beginning Knitting, and so that's the class right after, so if they want to continue on. In the first class, it's usually a 3 or 4 week session, an hour and a half per week of time that I spend, and I teach a hat in the beginning class and I teach a cowl in the Beyond Beginning class. Those very easily could be swapped out depending on the stitch pattern that you're going to use, but I do a hat in the first class. It seems to work well for me. Most women come to me through the library are glad that they get to make a project and that they get to keep the project even though they have to turn the needles and the leftover yarn back into the library to be reused again. They like having that they have knit something. And I usually tell them that your first hat may not be a work of art when you're done, but feel free to frame it because you might not be able to wear it. And they usually laugh. Usually that first hat will have some holes, it'll have some wonky ribbing on it, the gauge and tension might not be perfect. So I usually tell them that their first hat is kind of practice, and then the second hat will be the hat that they can wear. And I have some people who come to this class who have knit before. They just have forgotten how, or they can't quite remember how to cast on, or how to read a pattern, or what the stitches are. They did it in the past. So I kind of have to decide within that first hour of class whether or not those 8 knitters are all on the same level, right? Because usually they're at beginning and then I teach them the knit, and I'll have everyone knit their first 3 rows. That's what I ask them to knit. And the people who have knit before have those done like that. So you can really tell that they've had some knitting in their past. And then I say, "You've knit before?" And they say, "Oh, it's been 20 years. I didn't think I could pick it up." But I cast on for everyone in the class, and I usually cast on around 24 stitches, something that's divisible by 4. So when we get to practicing ribbing, then the numbers are even. But I will cast on everyone before class starts. So I will right as I'm introducing myself, and I kind of give them a little handout on where our local yarn store is, what some online shops are, what I like for beginning knitting books, and I have 2 or 3 of those. So I will put a picture of those in here. That they can purchase. I also have handouts from the internet for how to cast on, how to knit, how to purl, how to make a slip knot that I have printed out that the library provides for them to take home. I don't like to recommend that they go to YouTube to find something if they're stuck between one week and the next. I often have people come back more confused than not because they looked up casting on and it wasn't anything like what I showed, or they get a continental knitter and I'm teaching them how to throw. So I try to, unless I provide them with the link, I try to tell them to stay off YouTube because they can just go down a rabbit hole of confusion there. In the first class, I usually teach the knit stitch right away. I get started right away teaching the knit stitch. I teach it using the rhyme in through the front door, run around the back, out through the window, and off jumps Jack. And I have the rhyme printed out for them. And usually most people need to have something that they're saying in their head in order to get the rhythm going. Some people can do it with 1, 2, 3, 4. Some people need a little mnemonic for when they're bringing the yarn through to the front. They need to know dip and towards you. There are a few techniques there that some people need different wording in their head to kind of know, but that rhyme works pretty well for most people. And if they kind of get off, I'll say, where are you in the rhyme? And they'll say, I'm going to start over. And they can usually get on track with that. I usually have them knit 3 rows. I tell them that your brain is teaching your fingers how to move. And so for the first 3 rows, you have to be really patient. Women, especially adult women, can be really hard on themselves in those first few moments of class. And I have to make quite a few jokes about how, well, my tension seems off. Hers looks better than mine. How come my stitches are so tight? I said, well, you've been knitting for all of 3 minutes, so you should be perfect at it, right? Like, we really need to kind of get away from that judgment of how we're doing and just kind of let our brains teach our fingers to work. After about 3 rows, the fingers kind of know what they're doing. They have an idea. There's some muscle memory going on, and that really tends to settle in with people after about the 3rd row of knitting. But it can take the first row at least for people to get the 4 steps of the knit stitch. And some people take longer than others, and I have to gauge that too, who I have to spend more time with. Then I will kind of have decided in the class whether or not they can go on to purl in that first hour and a half class, or nope, we're not going on to purl this week. If I don't feel like the 8 students in that class have kind of got it, I will often teach the knitted cast on at the end of that class, because that's not teaching a new stitch. Really, a new technique is so much, and all they have to do is pull that loop bigger and put it up on the needle. That way, when they get home, if everything falls off the needle, if nothing else, they can get some stitches back on. My feeling is I never want a knitter to go from one week to the next without being able to practice. I ask them to practice for 15 minutes every day, and I tell them, please don't put your knitting away. If you put your knitting away, if you tuck it away so the kids can't touch it or the dog or the cat can't get it, next week, the night before, you will say, oh, I haven't practiced my knitting. But if you leave it out on the kitchen counter or the kitchen table or on the coffee table, even if you have to put a box over the top of it, you will see it and you will remember that you need to practice. So I ask them to practice just the knit stitch, sometimes the knit and purl, depending on what they've learned, at least for a week. But if everything falls off their needles the first night, or they make a mistake and they can't get going again, I don't ever want to be able to knit. So I hand out a business card at the first class and I say, this is a card for to phone a friend. And that means that you get to phone me twice for nothing. And you get to say to me, I'm messed up. I fell off and I can't practice. Or I've dropped 3 stitches and I can't get them back on the needle, and so I don't know what to do. Sometimes they can send me a picture and I can tell them what to do. Sometimes we can do a FaceTime chat and I can tell them what to do. And sometimes we need to do a drive-by. And I explain that is that you have your knitting in a little Ziploc bag and you bring it to me in the Target parking lot and you pass it out your window and I fix it and I hand it back to you and we've done our little drug deal and you're on your merry way. I always caution them with I'm a big girl, and if I'm busy, I will tell you, I can't get to until tomorrow, or Friday, I'm going to be in a local town, or tomorrow morning, I have a class here, and so if you want to drive to this point, usually within about 30 seconds to a minute, I can fix the problem and get them back on track. Oftentimes they will drive to my house, and we've gotten really used to having people run up to the front door, I fix it and give it back to them, and they're off on their own. But I only get 3 weeks, sometimes 4, and I will lose more knitters in that first week who can't figure out what they've done, can't practice, can't get it, and say, I tried knitting, I couldn't do it. And for me, it's all about making new knitters, so I will do whatever I can to help them get to there. Don't have a lot of people call in that first week, but by the second week, they know me better, and if one person calls and says, yeah, I called her, and she fixed it, and it was no big deal, then everybody else in the second week will call if they get to that point where everything's fallen off the needles. And I don't recommend that everybody do that. Sometimes there needs to be a sense of privacy, and I get that. But for me, this works well, and I offer it as an option. Every class you take with me, to phone a friends. In the second week, I will teach the purl if I haven't taught it already, or we will get right into ribbing, or I will teach the long tail cast on so that they can get started on working on their hats. So it kind of depends, and I really hate to say this is what I teach the first week and this is what I teach the second week, because sometimes you just can't get it done. I mean, I've had classes where everyone was really struggling. They were all brand new. I had 8 people and they were just not getting it. And I'm just not going to push that so that they get to the next step by the end of that hour and a half. Sometimes I have to run over in order to teach the purl, and I'll ask everyone, can you stay a little bit longer, and then we'll get into it. But you have to just decide how much time you have and how much you can pack into their brains and their minds. If it's going to really mess them up to learn the purl, then they can't learn the purl till the second week, because your brain knows how to knit now, and your fingers will try to do the knit stitch every time when you go to quickly teach the purl. They'll say, this is not what we were doing just a minute ago. So the brain will tell the fingers will kind of revolt and say, no, we know the knit stitch now, and so the purl can be hard to teach. And sometimes I wonder if that's why people hate the purl stitch so much, because to me, they're all 4 movements. They're just the opposite. It's not any harder to purl than it is to knit, and people hate purling. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So we will practice ribbing. We will cast on our hats doing the long tail or the knitted cast on. Knitted cast on is definitely slower, but people tend to get a better tension when they do that knitted cast on after they've done knitting. And so if you see that you have a lot of really tight knitters or really loose knitters, you have to kind of play with that as well. And then their homework for the week is to cast on and get the ribbing done, and they can also work into the stockinette section of the hat. The hat is a 1-inch rib with 4 inches of stockinette, depending on the size you use. I have about 4 sizes offered. You have to have enough stitches on the needle so that you don't have to do it on double points or 2 circs, or even the magic loop method. I don't teach any of those in the beginning class. We have a 16-inch circular needle, and that's what gets everybody by. And then on the last class, I'm hoping that at least one student can get to the decrease section of the top, because then I can show everybody with that one student doing it how to close the top of the hat, which is just a few decrease rounds, run the yarn through and cinch it up. That is a lot to get done in 3 weeks. That's why I've upped the size on the hat and the size of the needle that we're using, because I just had some people that couldn't get it done in the 3 weeks. Most recently, the library has upped my pay a little bit and offered the 4-week class, and it's just much easier. It is harder, and they told me to get people to commit to a month-long class every week. We have a lot easier time getting people to commit to 3 weeks and not missing a week. Once you get into that 4-week time slot, they tend to have to miss one of the weeks, which can cause kind of havoc too. But I teach enough that I can usually say to people, hey, can you come on Wednesday or Saturday and make it up and that kind of thing. So that will work for me. But the 4-week class is better to get everybody done with if people want to make a longer rib and flip their brim up, that's on them, but I tell them that that's not going to get the hat finished unless they really knit and get a lot of knitting done. And I have a number of people who say, yep, I will do it. I will knit every day and I will get 2 to 3 to 4 inches of that ribbing done so I can roll my hat brim up. That's really up to you in that respect. I will often show people what happens in that first class when they come back and they had 24 stitches on the needles and they come back and they have 28 or 30 or 32. So I'm going to show you all how I show that in the class. All right, I use these giant size 17 needles and this yarn rope in order to teach. So I can stand up in front of the entire class and show the knit and purl stitches and what I'm doing. And then I go around behind each person, often having to put my arms around their shoulders in order to help them put the needle in the right place. So I always ask about personal space and whether or not I can reach in around them, but sometimes you just have to in order to help. I often will teach this little trick because when you are a new knitter and you're knitting back and forth on new rows and you come and your piece is wider than it was the week before, this is what happens. This is how you make that mistake. So you are working across your rows and you turn around to go the other way and then you give them that little tip that you just switch hands. Then when you have your yarn that you knit into, and I tell them if you pull on this yarn, it tells you what the stitches that you're going into on that first piece right there, that's the stitch that I have to put my needle into. But if I say, oh, my yarn has to be in the back when I start, and I pull the yarn up like this over to the back, look what happens on the end there. I have 2 stitches to go into if I'm a new knitter and I don't know any better. So the yarn has to just hang down like this, and we don't pick it up and pull it over to the back to get started in that next row. Now my stitches are pretty even, and so it's harder to pull it up, but when you have a loosey-goosey stitch or 2 on your needles, it's pretty easy to pull that into the back like this and have 2 stitches there to go into, which is how it grows. And sometimes it only grows on one end and sometimes it grows on both ends. But that's because they're finishing a row, they're getting done, and they're pulling it up and over the back. So I sometimes will teach that in the first class because it happens, and sometimes I won't teach it till the second class because I saw that it happened during the week. But it's a nice tip for people to kind of see, and they usually can see it when you do it. They say, oh yeah, then that makes sense, especially when you have some colored yarn there, because then there are 2 purple stitches instead of just the red stitch that I'm pulling on. And you know, you have to teach them, and all the yarn has to hang down because you want all your scarf or your hat or everything to hang underneath and not be twisted around on the needle like that. So all those little tips and tricks that you can give them visuals for can really help. I'm going to put together this sheet on how I teach my beginning knitting classes, and I'll either put it up on Ravelry as a free pattern so that people can just go in and download it. I think that might be the easiest place for people to get it, and I'll also put some links on this sheet where people can go to get how to knit, how to purl, and there are there are picture of hands and needles in all of those so that people could take them home or print them out on their own. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment box below. This is just a question I got asked on my I Rock Knits podcast, and so I thought instead of not answering it for just one person, it might be better if I put it out for everyone. So feel free to ask any questions. I can try to, help you out. I think it's the best thing you can do is go into the world and make a new knitter. So until next time, or if you check me out on my podcast, keep it colorful. Bye for now.